2, the debate on clauses 25 to 30. So the question is that Part 2 stand part.
No, Mr. Chairman.
Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to speak in support of Part 2, and it's a relatively small part, but it is nevertheless reasonably important because it talks about the obligations that are placed on vans, that is the Veterans Affairs of New Zealand, and the rights that it accords to the veterans. And I think it is important that we codify the rights that veterans are entitled to, and we do place those obligations on the department. Often old people generally, but in particular vets, feel that because of their age they don't count for anything. They're not listened to, they are not treated with respect, and that some of that is perhaps a little unfair on Veterans Affairs, but it is certainly a feeling that the veterans themselves have. So in Part 2 we set out a code of veterans and other claimants' rights. It specifies what Veterans Affairs should do, and that refers back actually to Section 14 of the bill. Veterans Affairs have such responsibilities imposed on them as having to perform their functions and exercise their powers on reasonable grounds and in a timely manner. Now, the difficulty with any sort of code like that is that it is relatively subjective in how it's set out, but it does at least give those who are trying to exercise their rights something to refer to. It requires under 14B that the Veterans Affairs keeps veterans up to date on the progress of their claim and give notice of their decision. Again, that would seem a relatively straightforward and proper thing for them to do. And also, Veterans Affairs must tell the claimants about their review rights, that they have the right to apply for a review of any of the decisions made by Veterans Affairs on the claim, and they must do so at a time appropriate to enable the claimant to exercise their rights. So, relatively straightforward, but nevertheless important rights that are set out in the legislation. And it also requires that the person that drafts the Code of Rights is the Chief of Defence Force, and he must do that, or theoretically she must do that, as soon as practicable after the section comes into force. The CDF has to consult with a group that is established by the Minister, and this section sets out that that group must include the Royal New Zealand Returned and Services Association and other groups representing veterans and claimants. I think it's important that the veterans themselves are involved in this process of drawing up the Code of Rights. It means that the people who are affected by this legislation and by the Code do have an input into it. The final decision rests with the Minister, and the Minister must decide whether or not to approve that particular code. Presumably the Minister can send it back to the CDF if he feels that the code is not sufficiently full or comprehensive enough to cover the areas that need that coverage. The Minister must then, after he has approved the code, present the code to this House within 12 sitting days of Parliament to ensure that the House sees what is in the code, and the Minister must arrange for the approval of the code to be notified in the newspapers. So that's pretty much that clause. There is not a lot controversial about it. As I said before, the Labor Party in opposition is fully supportive of the main areas of this bill that are designed to promote the interests and to respect the interests of the veterans and the service that they have provided to this country.
Melissa Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I te kai whakamana tēnā koe. Koutou ngā rangatira o te whare nei, tēnā koutou, I runga